So hi, just a quick introduction from me. My name is Claire Elise. I'm one of the directors of Becoming Press, which is an independent publishing house based in Berlin, which typically orients itself around what we call minor theoretical literature. In other words, we make books, and we are here today to talk about our 12th book, which is called Empires Over Skin, How We Fashioned Our World by Meltdown Your Books, the author of our third book, also Where Does a Body Begin? This is supposed to be an interview or a dialogue, but in a way it feels a bit more like a seance. We're kind of having a Pythian encounter. You'll have to forgive the low-tech situation, as the only microphone I could find was this old SM57, which has been probably lying around since I was about 17 and was in punk bands back in the UK. But apart from that, I will also want to offer a kind of brief disclaimer that I'm not coming from a kind of background in fashion. I don't consider myself to be someone who's disinterested in fashion, but I'm mostly working with the material from this book, as well as my own kind of background in whatever it is that I do. Yeah, welcome, Meltdown Your Books. Can you hear me? Are you with us?
I'm here and I can hear you.
Okay, amazing.
I
I'm
think
gonna start.
you should
Okay,
say
sorry.
something though. To give everyone a pretext for your knowledge of fashion is that you revealed to me yesterday that you don't know who Anna Wintour is. I think that might not mean much to you, but to an audience that knows anything about fashion, that'll really set the stage for where you're at.
Yeah, you can just throw me right under the bus from the beginning. That's amazing. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Yes, so I would say it was like super, like almost kind of spiritually important for us to go back to the original cover of the Where Does the Body Begin? Because I think, as Rachel said, it's like the hardest cover ever in the history of biological theoretical literature. So I'm really glad that we're back to that, and it sort of paved the way for a really nice result with the Empires Over Skin. I think you've earned the only black covers in Becoming Press.
That really makes sense. If you knew me at a personal level, I only own black clothing. I really don't own any other color, so it really just sort of completes the look.
Yeah, I actually would have guessed. I don't know. I mean, yes. So I was happy to hear about this book from the beginning, from the inception, because maybe my interpretation of your sense of humor through Instagram is that while it can lean heavily into being, lean into like cynical themes or kind of darker themes and imagery, I find it very life affirming. And I feel like it's a sense of humor that plays on a love for a life that could be. So there's this kind of life affirming element to the cynicism. So I find it something that I relate to. And I guess we could start by simply asking, what's your background in fashion?
If I can take a huge left turn. Just last night I was watching this show, and this will reveal that I'm sort of that kind of person who mostly spends their days at home watching anime, which is I'm watching a show called Orb, which is sort of an alternate historical retelling of the discovery of the heliocentric model. And the whole show sort of focuses on these individuals' personal struggles because I don't know how familiar you are with astronomy, but Ptolemy's original model of the cosmos is very complex and sort of unintuitive and inaccurate, which is he imagines that around the Earth is this great orbit of all these planets who are themselves orbiting around other orbits. And then to make adjustments to that, you have to offset the axes of all these things. And even then, it's inaccurate. And the struggle of all these characters in the show is that they're true believers in God, and they want to believe that God would not make something so unrational, something so unbeautiful. And so their nature is to sort of struggle against that despite, church doctrine at the time and general common sense. And I find that I relate to that deeply because that's sort of my relationship to fashion, which is I'm deeply cynical about it, only in the sense that I truly think there's a more beautiful version of it that could exist. And that's sort of been my life because I grew up in Colorado, which might not mean something to your European audience, but as Americans, Colorado is sort of infamous for its horrible and ugly sort of clothes. It's sort of known as the anti-fashion capital of America. And growing up, I was sort of always at odds with that. I didn't really understand how to assemble a good-looking outfit, but I would assemble looks that were anti-Colorado, however that would look, however disastrous they might be. I wore all kinds of egregious colors or egregious materials just to sort of differentiate myself from that, because I didn't have a heliocentric model to sort of orient around. But I think fashion for me is the same as my like for art and music and anything else. It's the belief that the things around us could be made beautiful and coalesce into something worthwhile and worth engaging with.
The next thing I could ask about, in terms of the transition from Where Does the Body Begin, your first book, to Empires of the Skin, is, what was it that compelled you to go through this kind of horrible process of trying to write a book again? Because there were things about Where Does the Body Begin that you were not so satisfied with. And, from the beginning, I was kind of imposing onto this sequence of books, or I was imposing a sequence onto your two books and thinking, okay, so you started with the body and you moved on to fashion. But through talking to you, I understood that you were not really seeing it as this kind of progression. Actually, the reason that you turned from the body to fashion was more to do with trying to settle a score that you felt wasn't really settled in Where Does the Body Begin. So it's a bit of a long question, but I'm wondering if you could quickly go over what you see as the kind of problematique that runs through these two books.
If I could give sort of an insight into my process for a lot of things, which is David Lynch, if you're at all familiar with his sort of personal life, he lived a very ascetic and non-intense lifestyle. He sort of had routines, and he ate the same thing each day, and he drank the same coffee, and he lived the same life because he wanted to give himself the freedom to be creative in an intellectual space while sort of giving his life a sense of balance and structure that would improve the foundation of that. And honestly, I relate to that a lot in the sense that both my memes and my books come from the fact that I give myself a lot of opportunity to think about things and react in that moment. The book really stems from a single experience, both of them. Where Does a Body Begin comes from a single conversation I had with someone, and Empires Over Skin comes from a single video that I watched.
Here's how to be the most fashionable person in every room that you walk into.
Hello, I'm Shelley Duvall. Hello, I'm Shelley Duvall. Hello, I'm Shelley Duvall.
Personal style.
One thing about fashion that you have to...
I couldn't even tell you who the creator was, but it was a TikTok. And essentially the concept of the video was this girl describing, what her audience should do to become fashionable like her. And the premise of it was, there's nothing I could tell you because style is a totally individual thing. It's, it's your personal expression, and you just have to know who you are, and that'll come through in your fashion. And I was so frustrated with that video because it's such a deceptive thing to say to people. It's so funny for a fashionable person dressed in all the latest styles to be like, this is my personal identity. I simply chose to wear baggy pants in the season where baggy pants is fashionable, and I just happen to be wearing these, low-rise filas because, oh gosh, that just happens to be who I am as a person and has nothing to do with its sort of fashionable moment right now. And I felt the need to write this book, which ended up probably more philosophical than it should have if I wanted to reach that kind of audience. But I think the hope is that someone will watch that video and read my book and feel the discontent between those two worlds. So for me, the through line of those books is that I'm, as you kind of describe, someone who wants to believe that the world could be better, and I sort of live a happy life because of that. But it's sort of filled with deeply cynical things that sort of have the same sort of frustrations, and they always go back to the same sources.
I think it's, for me, clear, and I think it's very interesting that you're kind of revisiting the same problem from a completely different angle, as I say, starting instead from a kind of discontent with biology, but this time from something that maybe a lot more people can relate to. And there's a chance that if people are able to see themselves or identify with the book more or with the subject of the book more, then they might have a stronger chance of kind of getting the point that is sort of embedded in the subtext of both books. We can start to slowly sort of flesh out over the next 30 minutes or 40 minutes some ideas from the book, like without kind of trying to summarize. We can just maybe pick a few concepts and sort of work through them. Like, for example, dress versus fashion or coworker fashion. We would also like to talk about non-fashion. So maybe if we start with dress versus fashion, it gives the kind of easy opportunity for you to just kind of nail down a solid definition of fashion, or serve one if you prefer.
I think this is sort of the worst part of the book, in the sense that it's me dealing with the baggage of how people have talked about fashion in an academic lens for 100 years, which is, obviously we all have an intuitive knowledge of these things. You know, if I say you're wearing a costume, or you're wearing dress, or you're wearing fashion, everyone's got an intuitive sense for that, but fashion scholars create these very specific definitions for all these words to try and delineate different phenomenon. So you sort of run into a problem that's obviously very close to you guys in the philosophy world, because, you know, if I say to be, or I say eminently, or transcendentally, all of a sudden that carries this baggage of 2,000 years of thinkers. So at the beginning of the book is me just being a welcoming voice to try and situate you into these concepts and words, so that I can have a discussion about fashion and be a bit consistent with myself. Because, and I'll explain the problem now, is that there's two phenomenons. There's the phenomenon of wearing clothes at all. The fact that you go back, you know, thousands of years, and there's historical evidence of people wearing things for both adornment and perhaps for, you know, warmth or other practical reasons. And then there's this phenomenon of sheen dresses that come out every 2 weeks, and, you know, there's this constant urge to get the new thing and to dress in the newest and latest. These two phenomenons could both be called fashion in sort of the colloquial sense, but we want to differentiate between them to discuss them as different phenomenons. So we call this idea of wearing clothes at all, or adorning the body, as dress. And then we refer to this sort of perpetual change as fashion, which is unintuitive. And I read through the book multiple times trying to find myself misusing the words, because I just know that I'll drop into the colloquial usage of them. But I think I caught them all, so hopefully no one reads the book and finds me misusing the words. But really, the premise of the book is not dress. I'm not necessarily interested in clothing as it is, but I'm interested in fashion. I'm interested in the modern and postmodern phenomenon of consumption for consumption's sake.
Okay, I mean, we'll get into postmodernism, I think. I can't imagine that you wanted to talk about postmodernity in this book, as it's kind of, it brings with it so much baggage. But in the end, you dedicated a chapter to it. So would you be able to summarize what you feel is important to be talked about? Or what is important with postmodernity and fashion?
When I was writing this book, a lot in my head, I tried to imagine someone at a bookstore who had never read any philosophy, picking up the book and being able to read it to the end and understand what I meant. And I think I failed to some degree. I think people who follow my page will probably have some sense of these terms and can follow it. But, you know, maybe the completely philosophically uninclined will find it a bit difficult. So, in that sense, I spent an early part of the first chapter sort of defining postmodernism, with the hope that I could use it very lightly. I would just sort of dabble in explaining what postmodernity is and how that relates to the kinds of changes fashion has undergone in the past 50 years. But you're right, which is that problem sort of spirals out of control when you sort of realize it's the source and basis for all of our current and contemporary fashion trends on the internet. So really the point of that chapter is that in the early 20th century, the idea of the fashion image arose. We get the idea of fashion shoots and creating meaning of fashion outside of the clothes itself. You know, a lot of haute couture starts showing up in photos and not really being worn by people, but it helps to drive
economic value because you can see a dress worn on a particular celebrity and you can understand what that brand represents and what kind of person it's supposed to appeal to. But once you get to the 1980s and later, you start to see sort of the dominance of the image reach a pinnacle where it supersedes all other forms of meaning, and the image and the representations of fashion become the only thing that we're actually engaging in and trading in. When you take it to the extreme form, I talk a bit in the book about these modern AI platforms that are designed to create essentially fake images. You give it a description of a garment or you give it a picture of a garment, and it gives you an on-model photo that has no relevance to the actual garment. The shopping photography and the photos that you'll eventually take of that outfit at Coachella or whatever have no relation to the garment itself, because you can make garments that look a particular way in juxtaposition to the reality of how they're constructed. Famously, obviously, a lot of Coachella outfits are bought from these fast fashion retailers, and they don't even fit correctly or don't last out of the box, but they entirely succeed at their original purpose, which is to have a photo taken in them. You get to this sort of creation for images as opposed to creation for fashion, the item.
We can quickly move into, I think, the concept of coworker fashion. What would coworker fashion be in this context?
Yeah, so coworker fashion, which sort of ties into and is not different from the term I coined non-fashion in the book, sort of, again, stems from a personal experience that I sort of had to expand outwards to sort of come to terms with, which is, I describe this person in my book, who is a real person I worked with, and they dressed like you would imagine any man in the 21st century in an industrialized nation would dress. He wore cargo shorts and graphic t-shirts of Marvel heroes or whatever popular cultural property he was into, and, beat up sneakers, but in a sort of indescript way, like he could sink into 1,000 other men and you wouldn't be able to pull any of them apart. There was some sort of non-ness to his fashion. And then I met him after work, and he's wearing this leather jacket and like skinny jeans. And I'm like, well, that's absurd. You've never dressed like that before I've ever seen. I've known you for years. And he's like, oh, I dress like this all the time when I'm not at work. And it kind of hit me that the cargo shorts and the graphic t-shirts are a uniform. Like, he's like, oh, I've got to put on my uniform to go to work. And he, goes and pulls off the rack of cargo shorts, which is so absurd to me when I really thought about it, because, I work in academia and research. There's no uniform. You're not required to wear any. I wear some very crazy stuff to work, and it's never an issue. It never really conflicts with anything. But yet he felt this need to dress like this nothingness, to be no one, which sort of gets to non-fashion, the idea of being a non-fashion subject and wanting to dress in a way that bears no unique identity, which also ties into, if you're familiar with the concept of coworker music, this idea of like people without taste, people
who are automatons. So this weird automaton aspect sort of blends with this desire to be no one. And I spend a lot of the book in sort of this concept and mode.
And I think it's a really interesting concept to explore deeper.
Yeah, because I mean, the thing that we really need to say before we have a conversation about the non-fashion is, like, we're talking now about a definition of fashion that you said involves constant change. And another way of looking at constant change, if we come from a sort of philosophical background, and it's a word that is, again, as you say, kind of loaded. And I would also need to spend, as I kind of need to now, a minute or two explaining what the word negativity means. Negativity doesn't mean negative affect. It doesn't mean pessimistic. It doesn't mean it makes you feel bad. That's a different kind of negativity with different kind of connotational meanings than philosophical negativity, which in the most simple sense regards negation. And negation is simply when you do something in a way that is different to what came before. As you create something new, it is negating what came before it. And this is kind of popular within philosophy for quite a long time. I think even Hegel was saying something like negativity is the engine of dialectical becoming, or something like that. So negativity is this kind of important thing, and it ties into your idea of constant change. So what we end up with is a fashion that is kind of defined by constant negative change, constant negation. First of all, would you agree with that as a take on what we're talking about here?
Oh, absolutely. There's even a point in the book where I bring up, I can't remember his name right now. He has this theory of anti-fashion. Now, anti-fashion is this sort of another academic fashion term for any fashion that goes against the prevailing norms. But he has this theory that anti-fashion is the engine of fashion because it creates the negativity that allows for change, you know. In the 1970s, when punk style came about, you know, you get these distressed, worn jeans, and now that's such a prevailing element of the world, you know, Hailey Bieber.
These are just a couple of books that I've been reading. I love this one. Another one that I've been loving recently, this is actually my second copy of it. Yeah.
Giant celebrities wear distressed jeans. It has no anti-connotations, but it originally did, because anti-fashion creates this negativity that allows for perpetual change. And the idea of it is sort of propulsive to the idea of fashion in our contemporary moment, because you have to create meaning for fashion to become fashionable. If I say that this is the latest item in fashion, say it's a sneaker or a pair of pants, that pants has to signal something. It has to be a metaphor. It has to have symbolic content. It has to say, the person who wears this is Y2K, you know, they're irreverent, they're fun, they have a positive outlook, or perhaps they're serious and intellectual. It has to create some sort of symbolic meaning. And to create meaning, as you say, you need this engine of negativity. You need to be able to create a dialogue with what exists before, because if I say this new pair of pants has this kind of meaning, it has to exist in comparison to something else, which is sort of the most common way that you hear fashion being talked about, especially for people around our age group, right? There's the big delineation of millennials and Gen Z, and that has to do with, you know, the fit of your pants, the fit of your shirt, wearing V-necks or not wearing V-necks. It has to do with the lengths of the skirts or the dresses or the amount of detailing that you do. And all of this expresses some sort of symbolic content about what you relate to and what kind of person you are.
In the moment that you recognize that fashion is somehow this extension of identity, it's also bringing with it a point of negation, that you're always kind of trying to assert your identity in contrast to other people. I thought of something that might actually be a useful example to talk about, so that people kind of get a clear understanding of where we're going with this idea of negation. Let's talk about fashion designers, like famous fashion designers. These are kind of individuals who are, you know, organizing collections and organizing the labor and the fashion shows and all this kinds of stuff. But something that is relevant and comes up in your book that touched me personally, because it has a lot to do with music as well, which is kind of more my background. In music, you might have the idea of sampling and remix kind of culture, but would you agree that with fashion, it's difficult to even talk about the remix, because there's no mix, there's only remix. So in a sense, everything is a remix, so nothing is a remix. It's like the inner logic of fashion seems to be this kind of remixing, and in that sense you can see what we're talking about with negation, that everything is always being kind of, you know, there's this kind of negative recursion.
If I can say something kind of funny to that effect, which is, this year, a new creative director was appointed at Christian Dior, Jonathan Anderson. Now, Jonathan Anderson's a very decorated designer. I actually quite am fond of Jonathan Anderson, but there was sort of a funny dialogue that happened when he was brought on, which was a lot of people were saying, oh, Dior is going to come back, you know, he's going to go back to the house codes. And the house codes for a fashion house are sort of the things that are key to the brand and its history and its lineage. So for Dior, that's, you know, corsets and the new look, which was a style he pioneered in the 50s, which is a very specific look. But it's very funny for people to say Jonathan Anderson's going to bring back what Christian Dior did, because Christian Dior was referencing
the looks of, 50 years before him. He was specifically sort of known as a nostalgic, revisionist kind of designer in his own time and in the context of what he was doing. So, wherever you set the stake post as, oh, we're going back to there, you go back there and they're looking even further back. Not to cite Woody Allen, unfortunately, but he has a film called Midnight in Paris, and the premise is, the main character is obsessed with 1920s Paris, and he time travels to 1920s Paris. And they're obsessed with 1860s Paris, and they all want to travel back to then. And you get that sort of recursion in fashion because in the history of the past 150 years of fashion, there's not been a lot of technical innovation, I'll say. There's some very interesting things that have happened. Obviously, the athletic legging is something that did not exist 100 years ago, but we really haven't invented a lot of new fashion forms. We're sort of just modifying them ever so slightly, which is an important thing I talk about in the book, about these slight modifications. But the remix element that you're talking about is sort of built into the very seams and elements of how you design these things, because no one's really reinventing the forms at all. We're just sort of remixing the parts, which deeply ties into also the sort of intellectual property difficulties of fashion. I mean, me and you have talked about this at a separate time, but Steve Madden did an interview this year as well, where someone asked him, how many shoes have you ripped off? And he says, oh, I don't even know. There's so many shoes I've ripped off. But you can only say that in an industry like fashion, where how would you intellectually defend your shoe design as a concept? How would I say, no, I came up with this idea of a heel? How would you even convince a jury of that? It becomes too difficult. And the globalism of it becomes so difficult because, defending copyright law becomes very difficult if you think about the fact that all of these things are produced globally by all kinds of different creatives. How do I start even pursuing intellectual property laws, which is something that's held music back for a long time, which is music still exists within these discrete items, these albums and these recordings, and there's sort of a strong history of intellectual property law. Obviously, Bismarck, he lost a lawsuit in 1991 or something, and now no one's allowed to sample without, clearing it with the original sample place if you want to release it as music. And because of that, music is in a way more recessed in its intensity of difference and remixing than something like fashion.
None of this is to say that none of these designers are talented or something, because again, we can be cynical about fashion in the sense of treating it with some kind of critical scrutiny. But it's one of those situations where maybe brutal honesty about it actually helps me or helps people to recognize what is actually interesting about fashion. So in this sense, I feel like the cynicism is kind of beneficial. It certainly was for me. I wanted to basically say that there's something very honest about this constant remixing of fashion, this constant negation, this constant recursion, this constant taking things you've seen and doing them again differently, incorporation, all this kind of synthesizing. Because it makes me think of a famous quotation from, I believe it's Walter Pater. And he specifically said that all art aspires to the conditions of music. And for a while I wondered what that was, and there was this kind of famous quotation from, or this famous aphorism from Nietzsche, where he basically said, music is the best approximation of the eternal return due to its ceaseless differentiation and its inability to be reduced to an image. So maybe in the past, I would have thought that fashion was all image, so it didn't fulfill the conditions of music. But as I think I told you in another time, that I once tried to write an essay which took this idea of music and take it all the way as far as I could go. And I kind of paradoxically found or concluded that within this own definition, dance was more musical than music. Somehow dance seemed to fulfill the conditions of music even further. So maybe I would have thought once that fashion was kind of all image, but once I got to the point of dance, I could kind of extrapolate from there and say, well, in a way, fashion is kind of working the same way. It's all this negativity, this semiotic recursion. It can't be reduced to a single image. So I was wondering if you could take that and try to lead us towards the topic of like non-fashion.
This sort of idea, can something be reduced to, I guess in philosophical terms, a being? Is there an end goal? Is there a conclusive, true Platonic idea at the center of it that can't be reduced away? Or can't be changed away? Is an interesting way to look at art or media or experience. Because, in music you might say there's an irreducible element of the pulse, but obviously there's 20th century composers who sort of tried to fight the pulse and create musical forms which didn't engage with it. And then dance, of course. You might say that the key element is movement or, kinesthetic sensation, but there are dancers and performers who sort of play with non-movement in a way that's very similar. And in fashion, you might say that the irreducible form is the human body, but I think what's interesting about fashion and its uniqueness in the economic world is that it's sort of the poster child for escaping the physical and entering a realm of pure information or pure image, which is that, fashion is conceived of, designed, and sold without ever engaging with a body or ever being worn. And sometimes these fashion items aren't even intended to properly fit or shape to the body. Their purpose is to be photographed or engaged with in that kind of way. We just talked about that with Coachella outfits, but obviously that applies to haute couture and these things which exist to be on the runway as images, and they're not meant to be consumed. I mean, one of the most obvious examples is the Alexander McQueen performance that I mentioned in the book, where Shalom Harlow walks onto stage with a white dress and these robotic arms spray this paint across her. And it was very interesting. I was having a discussion with one of my sort of key advisors who I had a long conversation with about this book, named Labusha Kelly. And we were arguing about the meaning of this, and it was striking us both as such an important fashion thing to discuss. And for her, it's about sexual violence and charged degradation and assault on bodily autonomy. And for me, it's, this dichotomy and ecstasy and the subsumption of life into technology, but our different interpretations were so image-based. I mean, neither of us will ever wear this dress. Neither of us will ever engage. No one's ever going to wear the dress again. It sits in the museum collection at the Met, on display, and yet in our minds, it's one of the key elements of what fashion is now, is to talk about this particular dress. And in that sense, you get the idea of fashion now exists as sort of an information exchange. That dress was everything that fashion is in the contemporary moment. It was pivotal. It was key. Obviously, neither of us will wear this dress. In fact, no one will. It sits in the collection at the Met, and it exists to be this sort of image of a moment. The pivotal fashion moments and ideas exist primarily as images and moments within information channels. They exist as a confluence of symbols and not really as bodily or coherent forms.
So this takes us to the idea of non-fashion, which is that if fashion is the perpetual attention to these information channels and trying to create meaning and symbols, then non-fashion is the ability to fight that, to counteract.
And to constantly be wary of places which might have information or signaling capacity, and to negate it, to create a fashion that doesn't have meaning or doesn't generate any sort of discussion. One of the pivotal examples I could give is that there's a huge dialogue on women fashion forums or TikToks or Facebook or Reddit or wherever. The idea of the demure and fashionable work adult as a woman, which is that, there's this idea that as a woman you shouldn't dress provocatively, but also you shouldn't dress for attention or whatever that might entail. And of course there's misogynistic reasons and internalized misogyny around it.
To be an economic agent,
You're supposed to negate all the symbology and meaning generation that might come from charged feminine fashion. You're supposed to dress in a way that generates no discussion, no thoughts, no meanings. The sort of perpetual demureness at the center of nothing.
This is a topic that is worth talking about philosophically. It's worth exploring. It's an interesting new idea that I think your book is proposing. So I want to maybe introduce just a sort of name that is not that familiar to that many people, but Francois Laruelle is someone who coined the term non-philosophy. And for me, he's the person that I think of and whose concept of non is the one that I adhere the most to, or I'm the most interested or excited about. And it's this kind of interesting situation where instead of non-philosophical meaning not philosophical or unphilosophical, he's really talking about, in the simplest sense, capitalism or a way of life, or the way that the situation we're in, the context we're in, changes how philosophy is. And he's not unphilosophical or uninterested in philosophy. He's just trying to find a new way of doing philosophy that is kind of getting rid of or shaking off these kind of tendencies about it that he doesn't like. So when I get to non-fashion, I'm interested in the way that it must still be fashion. It doesn't mean unfashionable, or it doesn't mean necessarily not interested in fashion. There's a kind of paradoxical moment where it becomes maybe more fashion than fashion, or at least it reveals itself to be just fashion with a kind of additional signifier on the beginning. So if we say that as a kind of introduction, would you agree up until here? Would you recognize your non-fashion in my initial interpretation of it?
Laruelle is sort of an interesting place to start the jump off, because I'm not too familiar with him, but I understand, one of his primary interests is the jumping off point of a philosophical gesture, right? He has a lot of interest in, where the initial binaries come from and where the initial decisions become. For me, the jumping off point is Mark Ogg's book, Non-Places, where he talks about the idea of a place in anthropology is, a place that contains historical or symbolic or social meaning. And the non-place is a place that exists for purely functional reasons and has no sort of identity or meaning. And so, when you think of a non-place in examples like airports or hospitals, the best they could ever be is a purely functional place. You go there to get through and achieve your end of getting on a plane or getting to the doctor. And any sort of architectural or cultural complexity would simply make them more difficult or less functional. And in that sense, they are a gesture back to the beginning, the initial binary being established. So I do think there's a through line to Laruelle, because a non-place only exists in juxtaposition to the idea of the place to begin with. It sort of is a concept which arrives from your original schism. If you suggest that there are places with meanings, then there can always be places with non-meanings. And in that way, fashion leads to non-fashion. If you create a way of dressing which is always and perpetually generating meaning, then there will be an attempt to negate it to be a non-meaning. But because meaning is always, as we talked earlier, being generated by negativity, you are always creating new sources of meaning and new places of meaning in fashion, and so non-fashion must adapt. One of the great examples comes from a book by Grouse, who talks about the dad of the 1970s versus the dad of the 2000s, and both of them tell you, I'm not interested in fashion, but if you compare their outfits, you'll see almost no similarities. The 1970s dad is probably wearing a thick sweater made of heavy knit wool and corduroy jeans, and the 2000s dad is wearing a set of cheap khakis and a collared shirt with maybe a t-shirt underneath. And the similarity of them gestures to the fact that they're constantly trying to negate fashion. They want to dress in a way that's unremarkable and undistinguishable, but to do that, they have to constantly meet fashion at its own terms. Because if you dressed in the 1970s dad apparel now, you'd stick out as quite a fashionable or anti-fashion kind of person. You constantly have to know where the sites of meaning are and do the opposite. Just like wearing cargo shorts at a specific length is not fashionable, but if you get very, very short cargo shorts, all of a sudden it takes on this very specific and intentional meaning. And if you were to wear them even longer so they look like capris, all of a sudden you're not the average everyday man. Now you're making some sort of commentary on gender or performance because you're wearing something so provocatively feminine.
Yeah, I totally see the through line between the non-place of Mark Auge and Laruelle, especially because What you're talking about now is effectively the idea that, like, by tracking the change that you see in, let's say, male coworker fashion or something over the decades, there is this kind of constant change, and it doesn't look the same at any point. And so even though there is a kind of attempt by these people to throw off fashion, or an attempt to negate fashion by being unfashionable, in order to keep up with something that constantly changes, you have to be kind of paying a lot of attention to it, because it's literally moving on every time you look away. And I don't know if it's a good moment, but there's always this sort of amazing anecdote that I find. And I don't remember which book it was in from Baudrillard, but you can find the quotation actually in Victoria Grace's Baudrillard's Challenge. Baudrillard is another kind of media theorist, or sort of philosopher, non-philosopher, if you like, from the same period as Lacan, who is famous for saying this thing that the women doesn't exist, or, you know, I can't remember the French for that, but Baudrillard has this anecdote of sort of saying, well, actually, if anything, men don't exist, because if men are trying to constantly assert themselves in the positive against a kind of everything else, that everything else is just constantly changing, and it's this kind of indeterminate, unidentifiable thing. So it's a kind of impossibility to actually negate everything. So there is this kind of constant struggle to maintain an existence. And I find that there is this kind of uncanny sort of through line between this anecdotal point about male sex struggling to maintain itself. I think Baudrillard uses the like an erectile dysfunction kind of pun at some point. But then there's this connection to this kind of idea of the male fashion constantly trying to not be fashionable, trying to resist whatever it is about fashion. So what we find is that if we go back to your definition of fashion being defined by kind of constant change, non-fashion isn't not fashionable, or isn't not fashion. It's still very much orienting around fashion. It's still very much going to have this quality of constant change. And I think that's what you're observing, that even trying to deny this kind of mode of operation of fashion, if I don't know how to put it, but like even in trying to deny it, you end up kind of maybe working even harder, and you end up even more kind of fashionable, just in a different way.
I've had a very funny thought for a long time, to go back to your Baudrillard thing, which is they should do a game show for Baudrillard scholars where they put up a quote and you have to say what book it's from, because every Baudrillard book is the same book written slightly different. I swear I've read 15 Baudrillard books and I couldn't tell you what part is from what any of them are. You read something from America, which is ostensibly about America, and it's like any quote of this could really come from The Gulf War Did Not Take Place or The Transparency of Evil. What an interesting writer, in the sense that you could write the same book so many times and it would be interesting. But past my Baudrillard thought, there's something to what you're saying of the idea of the generation of negation, which is, you know, you look to the super hyper masculine forms in social media, you know, your Andrew Tates or your, you know, other kinds of hyper masculinity, the Asmongoulds or whatever other kinds of hyper masculine figures you want to talk about. They generate most of their meaning of what it means to be a man through negation. You know, most of Andrew Tate's posts on Twitter are men don't do this and men don't do that.
Okay, here are some things that I don't think men should be able to do.
It's constantly the creation of an other which requires their existence. There's never a positive assertion of what men do, other than in juxtaposition to other kinds of things, which is a very interesting position to be, because that binarism is sort of, I guess, fundamental to the idea of difference to begin with, if you really go back to sort of a Derrida kind of look at it. Non-fashion is sort of a unique binarism that has sort of emerged in the contemporary mode, because the binarism of fashion used to be the rich versus the poor. You know, the rich were fashionable, and that existed as a binarism against the poor. Your extensive collection of silks and fine garments existed to differentiate you from the practical garments of the peasantry. But now, because it's so easy to make complicated garments cheaply because of primitive accumulation and, you know, the subjugation of the third world, you get to this new dichotomy that must arise between sort of groups or individuals and the other, which is society. You know, it's a perpetual statement of individuality, which you must make by separating yourself from the other. And in that way, you look at Andrew Tate and it's really like every 3 months he releases a new season of clothing, which is his description of masculinity. Oh, masculinity does this now. It's so funny when I reflect back. There's an old clip of Andrew Tate before he really became famous that was talking about how if men didn't drink sparkling water, they're not real men. Which is so funny because I think now maybe the opposite opinion is happening among men, that, it's more masculine to just drink straight water. But that's like skinny jeans and baggy jeans. They're talking about what kind of little beverage they like to drink, and yet somehow that's their new fashion statement for what it means to be masculine.
Okay, here are some things that I think men should be able to have.
I'm like laughing because like I just know so little about these references, but like it's such a clear image to me, and it ties so well into what we're talking about, this kind of constant struggle to create.
You need to get your screen time up, clearly.
Yeah, I mean, I have hella screen time, but like I'm watching like
tomato concassé. That is a very simple, very fresh kind of tomato sauce.
I mean, there's basically just like one more leap that I was hoping to make, and I'm not sure I've done the best job of guiding us to this point, but it ties back into, I think, what we've been saying about, first of all, non-fashion, but then also this idea of constant change, and what I was talking about with music being a kind of best approximation of the real. What I was hoping to kind of get into is that where I used to think that music somehow approximated the universe, would your position be rather that it's better to think about the universe as somehow reflecting a model you would call fashion?
I think what's very interesting is when you think of approximations of the real world, whether it's through science or if you imagine music as some sort of approximation of some sort of non-conscious experience of, things in of themselves, which people like to think of music because of music's sort of intense psychological experience. I do think that each of these things carries a bit of the real world as you might think of it, because the real world is only constituted through the 5 senses, in the sense that we experience things in of themselves. And each of these mediums sort of refers to, I say 5 senses, really, there should be a 6, because there's the kinesthetic sense. Each of these refers to a form of it, right? Which is the eyes, the ears, the sensation of your kinesthetic body moving. Each of these appeal to a sense of the thing in of themselves in a particular sense. And I don't tend to think of them as different in that sense. I tend to think of music and fashion and art as sort of a continuous stream of different ways of expressing these kinds of things, which ties into how a lot of fashion designers think of themselves, which is not necessarily trapped within the medium of fashion, but as opposed to that sort of blending multiple modalities. Jun Takahashi, the creative director of Undercover, one of my favorite designers, goes by the credo, we don't make clothes, we make noise, because he thinks of himself in the lineage of musicians and expressing sort of existential and intense feelings and political expression through clothes the same way that punk bands did. And when you go to people like John Galliano or Yohji Yamamoto, they sort of think of themselves in the lineage of visual artists and, cultural figures. I think music and dance and these other mediums are perhaps more recessed and more held back by their sort of belief that these other things must be separate. They sort of think of themselves as, I am a musician, whereas fashion designers sort of approach it in a multimodal sense. They think, at this moment, I am designing fashion. And in this sense, they allow themselves sort of the becoming and renewal that is really true to the human experience of being a creative or expressional person. And fashion designers in this sense, I think, have maybe superseded other people to get at more intense expressions of those things. If you look at Alexander McQueen, he thought of himself as a fashion designer, but also a director, a performance artist, a spectacle, a living artistic expression in the same way that you might think of, like, Nietzsche thought of himself as the medium of expression, that he himself is sort of the becoming. and Alexander McQueen viewed himself like that. Whereas I'm not sure that I can think of too many musicians who really view the world like that.
I think because we're almost finished with the time, there's a chance that we can just wrap up here. I think in the last question, I was sort of thinking about whether we could close on some sort of elaboration about the subtitle, because in a way, the way that it's written, it implies you fashion something, you create it. So what I was sort of exploring in my last question was, to what extent are we fashioning our world? Like, could we look at it from like a world building perspective?
A second book that could be released that's just a list of all the titles and subtitles that I've been through and looked at. It really was a point where I had 100 titles and I was handing people a spreadsheet and I would have them look at it and decide which one they thought was best. At one point it was called Will We Be Beautiful, which is now the title of the final chapter. The subtitle was difficult because I wanted to communicate what the book was in a very literal way. The title is very metaphorical and sort of poetic because obviously a title should be a bit more of a non sequitur. You know, it shouldn't gesture to what the book is in of itself, but the subtitle and where I had landed on how we fashioned our world is because of that sort of wordplay, which hopefully translates when we send the book around the world. But the fashioning is interesting to me because when you think of fashion, the phenomenon, it really becomes a phenomenon because of the emergence of machining and tools during the Industrial Revolution. There's a quote from Engels in the book where he says, you know, the Industrial Revolution happened because we wanted to make cotton garments. And I think that's what's so interesting, is that the very buildings and world that we live in is sort of a world designed and structured for the creation of fashion in some ways. You know, I live in a high-rise skyscraper, and that's only possible through the technological revolutions that first existed to spin cotton and to harvest it at a quicker rate. All of these things sort of extend from our clothing and how we want to represent and exist in a social experience. So when we say fashion, we talk about ourselves. And really, to the point of the whole book, we really express something about all of society and the places we take inside of it. Every piece of clothing you wear is a reflection of everyone you've ever met and everything you've ever done. And in that sense, you know, you fashion yourself and you make your gesture towards fashioning the world. And if I can say anything, I think that's the core premise of the book.
Amazing. I think that really hits the nail.